What a thing to
Classy.
be, what a thing to be known for.
Yeah, hey. So we've got
Well,
that going for us.
yeah. Well, it's the cherry blossoms are nice too. So there's murder and cherry blossoms.
That's right.
Not to be
Lovely.
too cynical. Well, happy Monday and happy belated Mother's Day to any moms out there. We
Thanks.
are live on solid ground. It is Monday, May 13th. I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and I'm here with Jennifer Friend. Deborah Knox is not with us this week. She'll be with us again next week. And we have Carolyn Stirling with us this week to talk with us about, I don't know what. We'll talk about some things. And Carolyn, I called you a canceled dancer.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah,
accurate.
but it's really
Yeah.
nice to have you with us. I'm glad you could join us. Carolyn's a friend of mine, and we had some really interesting conversations recently that I thought would be interesting to explore on one
Mhm.
of these streams. So I'm glad you were game for that. And
Yeah, thanks for having me.
thank you for being here. I usually ask Deborah, she does such a good job of saying who we are when we do our intro to Solid Ground. Jennifer, do you know who we are?
Oh
Could you
no.
talk about what Solid Ground is?
I don't know who I am those days. Yes. Okay. I'm actually going to pull it up because we do have like a little blurb and I want to pull that up. Okay. Here's the blurb. Solid Ground is a peer support community. We offer peer support in a group and individual format, as well as strategic consultations for individuals who may be contemplating taking action. We're here to support people who are concerned about um, the impacts of oppressive ideologies and such as woke and COVID mandates. And nothing we do constitutes legal advice or psychotherapy and should not be construed as such. And you can join our community for $5 a month at solidgroundsupport.org.
Awesome. Yes, please join us. And David Moore says, cheers and have a good day. Thanks, David. I hope you're having a good day too. We are, well, I guess we've talked a lot about different issues around sexual morality. And we talked about pornography a few times, around issues of needing to restrain and master one's sexual desire. And it it feels like we end up kind of being hard on the men to some extent when we're doing that. Like we're talking mostly to men, and men are feeling that in the chat. We're seeing that. But and Carolyn and I had this conversation the other day that was really interesting, and it was about the idea of exhibitionism and loving, to the feeling of being attractive, and this very female version of sexuality that I think I've gotten out of touch with as I've gotten older. I'm not, there was a time when I wanted to feel attractive and kind of showy in this certain way, but I never really got into the performance lifestyle or anything. And Carolyn, you had this insight into it based on your years in dance. And I don't know really where to go with that, but it was an interesting conversation. And I wonder if could you kind of talk a little bit about your dance background first, and maybe we'll get into some of that.
Sure. I was a belly dancer, a tribal fusion belly dancer, and I studied that for, about 15 years. And I performed hundreds of times, easy. Um, and I loved it. And there was a community around that, mostly women. And in general, I would say it was a very supportive and kind community. And um, I hadn't really experienced that before among women. In my past, before that, women were typically sort of catty to each other and mean, but this was a very inclusive and loving community of women, and it was it was wonderful. And I produced a show for 10 years in Seattle, and was once a month. Every month had a different theme, and we just had so much fun with it. And just about everybody from the community was in it at some point. And it was relatively low drama and so much fun and so much creativity. And it was a blast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you did this all the way up until COVID, and I know we're kind of meandering off of the original like premise that I set up, but I don't know if you want to talk about your experiences around that. Don't feel like you have to if you don't want to.
Oh, no, it's fine. I could talk about COVID all day. Yeah, when COVID happened, I mean, I had been moving to the right politically over time. I moved here to Seattle about 20 years ago, and I was super lefty, democratic socialist and all that stuff. And over time, I started moving to the right, especially when I had a kid about 11 years ago. I started becoming more concerned about children and their influences and the public schools and all this stuff. And I drifted right, and the community is left, and they drifted even more left. And so my Facebook posts became increasingly offensive to people. And the straw that broke the camel's back was COVID. And I have an interesting background. One of my first jobs out of college was working for an NIH funded study in diabetes. And I noticed that the way they were conducting the study was not consistent with what I had learned in school about how medical research is supposed to be conducted. And so I was really naive, and I would point it out, and I would say, hey, you're not supposed to look at the study data and tweak the protocol. We were told not to do that. And of course, they knew exactly what they were doing. And I was putting my job at risk, and I was so naive, I didn't know that. And so I had a unique perspective. I had seen the malfeasance in medical research, and I was able to recognize early on that COVID was bullshit. The way it was being managed, the way it was being framed, everything, the PCR tests, all that. Mm-hmm. And so as a person who saw what I thought was happening, I felt a duty to say something. I felt like I didn't want people to get that shot that I cared about. And I felt like our freedoms were at risk. And I just felt like I had to say something. So I said something vocally and often, and especially on my Facebook page. I go there way too much, I admit. Anyway, I started having arguments with people online. And when the lockdowns happened, the show was effectively not going to happen because of vaccine mandates and masks and all that. And I wasn't going to do any of that stuff. And so I canceled. I just said, I'm not going to do the show anymore. Even when the mandate or the lockdowns are over, I'm still not going to do it because things had been winding down anyway. And I just was so disillusioned in my community and thoroughly disgusted with what I was seeing. I just didn't want to do it anymore. And I think, honestly, in the back of my mind, I always suspected that the people who were in the show were not my real friends, that I had something they wanted. And so they were putting up with me, and I no longer had something they wanted. And so the straw that broke the camel's back was there were a bunch of people protesting the lockdowns. And someone posted that they were Nazis. And I made a post and I said, they're not Nazis. They're protesting these unconstitutional lockdowns and fighting for our freedoms, and we should be grateful to them. Well, that got twisted, and the story became I'm a Nazi and I support Nazis, which is insane. Anybody who knows me for 5 minutes knows that's not true. And it seemed as if no matter what I said, they were not hearing me. I would say one thing and they would interpret it completely differently and twist it. And so it just became so ugly. And I thought, after knowing me for 10, 15 years and seeing how inclusive and reasonable I am, that would have mattered, but it didn't matter. COVID made people lose their minds, it seemed. And so that became it. And there was this ugly gossiping and reputation destruction campaign against me. And it was really hurtful. And there are a few people in the community that reached out to me and you know, still welcome me, but for the most part, it's over. So that was difficult.
Yeah, what a terrible experience to go from having a community that felt good, as you described, this sense of sisterhood and connection, to falling apart in that particular way and feeling singled out.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, even though history has proven me right, you know, I was always very reasonable, you know. I always had articles and evidence to back up whatever I was saying, but it didn't seem to matter. And like I said, they were not hearing me. And I remember learning about projection in college, you know, Sigmund Freud's theory about that, and thinking, oh, that's BS, that doesn't happen. But now I think it's absolutely true, and I see it everywhere. I wasn't the Nazi, let's just put it that way. You know what I mean? I wasn't the fascist trying to tell people they have to do this or that. If that was their perspective, not mine. And so I think that was a lot of it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing about that. What a difficult experience. And your time in dance. So I guess this is it's kind of a poor segue, but Jennifer and I have had this conversation running for, I don't know, a few months. We've done a number of these conversations where we've had Jenny Holland with us, and we've talked about beauty and sexuality and all these different aspects of sexual connection and health and love and what it means to be a mother. And I hope we get to resume those conversations at some point when all of our schedules can come back together. But something you and I were talking about the other day really kind of tapped into that same thread in a way. And I was thinking about something I've thought about a lot, because I've been contemplating and researching and having discussions around pornography quite a bit lately. There does seem to be this arc, and I know pornography is this really far end of a spectrum, but there's this arc that you see over and over again with younger women who are engaging in something like pornography, and when they're older, they're critical of what they were doing, and they now see it as sort of this exploitation that they went through when they were younger. But you can't really see that in the young person, because they seem like they're engaging freely and joyfully, or at least getting something out of it. But when they're older, they have a different story. It seems like I'm maybe Jennifer, I don't know if you can help me articulate this, if you've had the same thought, but it's really interesting how over the lifespan, we are so different in relationship to parts of our sexual personality, I guess. Is any of this connecting, and do you guys kind of get what I'm talking about here?
I think it has to do in part with the stages of life for female, the sort of maiden mother crone. And I think that a lot of our behavior when we're young, honestly, is driven by this wild surge of hormones, and a lot of unconscious response to those hormones, which is as it just is and has to be. And I think it's really it's sort of the life force moving through us and putting us out into the sphere of sexuality and interpersonal relationships, really, so that we can be pregnant and bring forth life. That's what I think is driving us. But I think a lot of it's unconscious, oh, I'm wearing these shorts with high heels for myself. Okay, well, you are in some sense, because you are enjoying your own sexuality and your own beauty, but there's also a reason why that's enjoyable to you. And I think that's hardwired into our systems. And I think that, like anything else, when we're young, there's really wonderful aspects to how we experience our sexuality, and then there's aspects to it that end up not being good for us and not being healthy for us long term. And I think that when we start emerging from the haze of hormones, we see things a bit more like objectively and with some distance. And we see that some of the things that happened, as well as some of the decisions that we made, ultimately were not in our best interest. And I'm not saying this goes for everybody, but I think this goes for a lot of people, particularly people who really kind of have experiences that are maybe sort of life-shaping or life-changing or even traumatic.
Yeah, I think obviously something like pornography or sex work in any kind of way. And is it true that the pride flag added sex workers to their flag? Is that really a thing, or was that apocryphal?
Yep, it's true.
Oh gosh. So obviously that falls on a really far end of the spectrum. And that was part of the thing that you and I were discussing, Carolyn, about how belly dancing used to be it's a very sensual, beautiful art. And it shows the female form, it shows the seductive form, but it's really quite tame in comparison with some of the things that we're seeing now. And you even mentioned burlesque, which can also be really beautiful and incorporate art and humor and other things. It's not just this raw stripping. It's more of an art than that. But there was this term, and I don't know who came up with it. I think it was Jenny Holland. She said that something about the sexual arms race. Like if somebody is doing this, if this person's showing this much, well, if you're not showing that much, then you're not even going to get noticed. And so there's this kind of I think you said something about this, Carolyn, about if now that they're all doing that, belly dancing is like, huh, what, who's even looking at that anymore when you can look at all this? And so it's there's a spectrum. There's the girl who gets cute and goes out and feels good because some people look at her. And then there's the person who goes and does performance. And then there's the performance with more nudity. And then there's the, all the way to something really sexual. And, but that continuum of enjoying that exhibitionism is something I think that most of us can find ourselves somewhere on that continuum, or at least can relate to that at some point in our lives.
Yeah. Well, I never thought of myself as an exhibitionist. I mean, clearly, I guess I was, but I was an artist. I had an expression that I wanted to put out there and share. And the fact that I was showing my belly was sort of incidental. I mean, it was the uniform that we wear, and it's not necessary to wear that either. You could choose to wear a dress or something, which I did at times. And it was a community. I think the reason why belly dance isn't more popular anymore is, one, it's not as titillating as it once was, because, as you say, the art forms have moved on to become more in your face and explicit, and the culture's preferring that at the moment. But also, it's inclusive of people who are not skinny and people who are not young. And So the audience tends to be other dancers
Mm.
mostly, and their family and friends. So it's more of a community thing than a general public thing, in usually. But back to what you were saying before about why some women start to become more or prudish is the word you use as they get older. Maybe they're just done. Maybe they've, tried that avenue of getting attention and they've realized that it doesn't give them what they want, or they've had enough. As I was getting on in my career, I got kind of jaded with it. I would sort of I was so good at it that I didn't have to prepare as much. And I'd been there, done that so many times that, I mean, I still loved it and I was still enjoying it, but I didn't get as nervous, and it was just a different feeling.
Mm.
And another thing I note is that I don't know how much I want to reveal about myself here, but when you're promiscuous sexually, after a while you realize it's not fun. It's not getting you what you want. You're not getting love. You're getting a fake love, a proximity of love, but it's not getting you what you want. And so I think a lot of these women they just grew up some and realized that that it's not real love. It's just somebody using you.
Yeah. Jonathan Townsend says, for myself, I was conflicted with pornography from the start at age 11. It was and remained bad, but felt good. It was a fascination, always incurred guilt and shame, but also a salve. That's interesting. And it's so interesting. All of the parts of this, I guess that's the word of the day. I keep saying it. But when we talk about something like porn or or sex work in general, and I know that's the farther end of the spectrum. We're just it's one side. It's like the extreme, the concentrate of exhibitionism. It's really easy just to talk about it in this really general way. Like, what is it? It just becomes this word or this thought, but you kind of lose sight of what the content is, or at least I can when we're talking about it. But what the content is lots of different things. And some of that is voluntary engagement. Some of it is exploitation by someone else. But a lot of it is probably people who are trying to seek that same kind of love that you're talking about, that same kind of approval. And I can remember that too, as a younger woman, feeling a lot of validation from having other people give me feedback that said that I was pretty or attractive or worthy or wanting to ask me out or something like that. It was just that sort of feedback felt really meaningful at that point in my life. Felt like the kind of a message that says you're okay and you're worth something. So I could see people going to a farther extent depending on their own life circumstances.
Mm-hmm. For me, if someone compliments me and I don't think I did well, it doesn't penetrate, right? I just sort of go, they're just saying, they don't really mean it. And if somebody tells me I did poorly and I agree, then it wounds me because I know they're right. Or if I did well, I feel like what I feel about myself is so much more important than what anybody else tells me. Because oftentimes, people would applaud and like what I did, and it didn't get in, like, because I've always struggled with low self-esteem, which is odd that I became a performer. But yeah, no matter how much people would tell me, you're beautiful, you're amazing, I didn't believe it until, later. The reason I got into performing was because I wanted to get over myself. Like, I wanted to have when I was in high school, I would audition for plays, and when I would try to sing, my throat would close up unintentionally, and that bothered me because I knew I could sing, but I couldn't do it in front of other people. And so I had this block that I wanted to overcome, and I did. And so it was a vehicle for growth. It wasn't just me trying to get other people to approve of me. It was me trying to get me to approve of me. Mm-hmm. And so there's more to it than me just being an exhibitionist mm-hmm. or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really sounds like it was an art form for you that you took really seriously, or is an art form for mm-hmm. you and that's why what you're saying about self-esteem, that seems to fit in really well, actually. It's like the lack of self-acceptance makes those outside affirmations so much more valuable to us, I think, because we're trying to build something for ourselves. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Jennifer?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that for girls, having a sense of your own beauty is having a sense of power in the world. And also a sense that that you will be loved. And I don't think that that's a bad thing at all. I think it is what it is. And at the same time, I think we have to be careful with it, because that's where we get caught sometimes in bad situations, is being too much on this, too dependent on that, and maybe dependent on it from the wrong sources. And I think the more extreme version that you mentioned of, somebody actually doing pornography, I think that that's when the normal female desire to be considered beautiful, to have that part of us seen, I think that's when, through trauma, that part has become sort of damaged and unbalanced. And now the person will go to these sort of like extraordinary means, and that in turn then becomes more traumatizing for them. So they come to it because of some kind of trauma or wound, and then they're very frequently re-wounded and re-traumatized. And, I think that being female in and of itself makes us inherently vulnerable. And women haven't really been taught how to hold that vulnerability and protect ourselves. We've been essentially, I think, sold a false bill of goods that the way to be less vulnerable is to be more like men, and to be more sociosexual, and to view sex more casually. And that is ultimately not in our best interests. And I think that it damages us.
Where would you draw a line in terms of what is going to re-traumatize, or what is personally exploitative and not healthy, say between something like artful dancing to then burlesque to then stripping? I mean, where would the line be? Is burlesque something that is healthy, and then stripping not?
I've seen very, very little burlesque, so I don't know that I can comment on it intelligently. The little that I did see, I thought was flirtatious and quirky and funny and kind of stylish. And but I don't know how far burlesque goes. But I think that once you're working someplace as a stripper and you're doing lap dances, you're essentially a sex worker of sorts. And the people that I've talked to that have been in that industry at the time, they often feel empowered by it. People don't do it because they're stupid. You're obviously getting something, and sometimes you're getting a short-term fix to a really, really severe problem of maybe poverty, maybe being a single mom, maybe trying to put yourself through school. but later on, they often feel really regretful and talk about some negative experiences or even frightening, dangerous experiences that they had, and talk about it in terms of it being damaging in some way to their sense of self. And of course, I think that can differ for different people. I don't want to say I know what's best for all women, and any woman who strips is going to be horribly traumatized by it. I don't think I can say that. I think it's generally true, though. And I don't think it has an overall positive effect on male and female relationships. So it's not a field, a career field that I feel positive about.
What are your thoughts, Carolyn?
Well, I've known a lot of burlesque dancers and maybe a handful of strippers. And I went to a strip club in Tampa, Florida that was really famous. And I was expecting to see like pole dancing and all this really amazing artistry. And I didn't. The girls were just sort of glazed eyes and sort of swaying on a pole. And it was gross. It was not artistry. But burlesque is definitely artistry. Those women make costumes and glue rhinestones to everything and go to school for it. I mean, it's incredible. But at the end of every performance, there's a reveal of your breasts, at least. Well, that's actually as far as it goes. And those women, the burlesque dancers that I've known are some of the most empowered women I've ever met, or at least that's how they appear. And they're making a conscious decision to, one of my stripper friends said that men are vulnerable in that they think with their penis, right? And so she's going to take full advantage of that. She's going to take their money. And it seemed like a little bit of misandry there, a little man contempt there. But they know they can make a lot of money this way. And they, at least the burlesque dancers really enjoy it. It's a fun job for them. They get to be creative. So there aren't too many jobs in this world where a woman can be creative and have fun and make a ton of money. And burlesque dancers don't have to interact with the audience at all. So that's where their line is. You know, we all have our line of where we won't cross. And that's where their line is. At the strip club I went to in Tampa, you know, like Jennifer said, there, you know, it is sex work. There is touching and that sort of thing. So yeah. I don't think you can always say that strippers are being exploited or whatever, but it did seem that way.
That seems like a pretty clear line.
Yeah.
Crossing over into sort of transactional sexual acts instead of something with art and choreography and a barrier between you and the audience. Yeah,
exactly. And there are some dancers, belly dancers, who'll do like private parties, and people will think that means you can touch her or you can, you know, and they do this thing where they'll put dollar bills in your costume. And I never did that. I never wanted to do that because it just felt like it crossed the line for me. And so often when belly dancers would do private parties, they would bring a man with them to protect them. So there's a lot of gray area.
Well, yeah, it's that's really fascinating. I remember being I guess I would have been around 20 or 21, and I worked in a bar. And a man who was one of the regular patrons of the bar, he owned a strip club nearby. And so sometimes the strippers would come in after their shift, and they would always look really glamorous and gorgeous. They just had like tons of makeup. They had high heels. They had cute outfits. They had really nice figures. And they were just, it seemed very glamorous to me at the time. And he asked me multiple times if I wanted to come and work for him. And I remember feeling super flattered by this. This was a really flattering idea. Like I guess my image of them at that time was akin to what you're talking about with the burlesque, and maybe what you were expecting when you walked into that Florida club, when you were expecting it to be this glamorous experience, and then you got the reality was something very different. But it was something I felt flattered by it, but I could never see myself doing it. It was just a hard no from me on that. I just, thank you. And it was it felt like an ego boost. It didn't feel at the time like I was being asked to exploit myself. It felt like I was being told that I was desirable, which is really interesting now looking back at that. But it was something I just couldn't imagine telling my mom that I was doing that. I couldn't imagine, or my dad, like telling my parents, like I didn't want to work in a place I'd have to hide from my family. And it wasn't something I could even consider.
Well, maybe there's a difference then between knowing you could be a stripper and actually being a stripper.
Maybe.
What were your parents telling you growing up about that kind of job or that kind of person? Was there a explicit or implicit message to you that we don't do that sort of thing?
Well, there must have been. That's a good question. My mom was what we would call sex positive now, but that wasn't a phrase that was fashionable then. So she was really open, and she taught me about stuff early. I think that there was too much early exposure to sexual content, actually, because when I asked questions, for instance, when I was 5-ish years old and had an experience where I had some questions about stuff. I guess I could get into that, but it's kind of a longer story. I had some questions about some things that I had seen. She broke out the joy of sex to teach me. This is what I was a little kid. I mean, 4 or 5. I think it was before I started kindergarten. And so she broke out the joy of sex, and she's showing me these pictures, and there's it was the old, I don't know, I haven't seen an updated one, but I hear there's an updated one that has photographs, but this was an old one and it was all drawings. And so there was like this hippie couple with all this body hair and long hair, and I was really freaked out by what I saw. I thought now I was terrified of men, and I thought they all had monsters in their pants, and it was too much too soon, this reveal. I mean, I really have sympathy for people who encounter porn early and don't know what they're experiencing, because this was kind of that version of it for me. But my mom was really open. She probably would have been happy if she'd walked out into the living room and seen me leafing through that book any given day. She would have been like, "Oh, honey, and let's talk about this and that." So there was a real openness with ideas around sexuality and nudity and the body and stuff. I don't remember any messaging around prostitution or sex work, but there was definitely no positive attitude toward it in my home. And my mom was a theater actor also. She did musical theater. She sang in opera workshops and did stage productions and stuff. So and then she did dance. She did Afro-Cuban dance for years when I was a teenager and in my 20s and on. So there was a lot of performance, but never, I never would have considered transactional sex to be okay based on anything I saw growing up.
You know what's funny? I recently moved to Florida, where my family of origin lives, and I was asked if I would teach belly dance at a community center in the resort where they live, and I couldn't picture myself doing it there where my family is. I mean, it felt like when I moved here to Seattle, I reinvented myself. Nobody knew me. I could be anybody I wanted. And that's what I became, as a professional dancer. But when I went back home, it was like I couldn't be sexy around my parents. And I never thought of what I was doing was sexy, but it was, and it wasn't for me. I don't know. It was a weird thing when I thought about doing it around my family.
That's really fascinating. And I think maybe it speaks to something like that. For me, thinking about my family was a real, it put the brakes on any kind of, it gave me guardrails and limitations when I thought about that proposition. Hey, do you want to work in a strip club? My first thought was, well, I couldn't tell my parents that. I'm not going to do that. I mean, and so even something more tame and less exploitative, just an art that involves expressions of sensuality, that for you would have been hard to do around your family. You needed to make a break and be somebody independent of that in order to express that part of yourself.
And the odd thing is I got the idea of belly dancing from my mother. She was the one who was doing it when I was a little girl. She was taking lessons, and she did it for us in the living room. And I was like, and so, 20, 30 years later, then I start doing it. But for some reason, I still had that hang up.
Mm-hmm.
I might have chosen to, push past it eventually if I'd stayed, but it was weird.
Yeah.
And so that begs the question, do I honestly deep down feel like there's something wrong with it? Do I feel like, I mean, and I don't think so, because I told them I was doing it, and I, sent them my website, but I don't know, they never showed much interest in it.
Well, in the chat, Jonathan Townsend, again, he says, I suppose as adults, we form ourselves away from our family. Some things have to be private from them. And that makes sense to me. Like I don't necessarily think that just because there's some elements of yourself that you don't want to express within your family, that those things are shameful to you or don't feel like a part of an honest and authentic part of yourself. But I do wonder about some of the more extreme versions of expression. Like when I think, Jennifer, you were talking about what would make somebody go from a more, I don't want to use the word healthy because it sounds like it's asked and answered and judged, but just for simplicity's sake. So a healthier version of this love of showmanship and looking for a particular kind of affirmation. Like let's use burlesque as the example, because you talked about that being really empowering and yet still very artful. So somebody who would want to do something like that, but crossing that line and going into sex work or stripping or lap dances and stuff. And I think you used the word trauma in there. Like there's something is broken or hurt in a person, let's say, if for argument's sake, that is willing to be exploited in these particular ways. And I wonder if it's the family, the division from family could be a big part of that. Something with your family, that there's either a break in your relationship or a break within your original family that allows you to take that step. I'm just kind of playing around with these ideas right now.
Absent father, maybe, or father who never gives love and approval. But I think that sex, and I don't mean this in a way that sex is just for procreation, because that's 100% not true. But the reality is sex is the vehicle for life. And therefore, there is something profoundly sacred about it. And there also, because of that, there has to be, and there is something mysterious about it. And when you try to kill that mystery by doing something like pornography, I think it does something to the sacred. It kind of squashes the life out of it. And that's what I think is ultimately really negative about it, is you're taking something that's sacred, that's literally the key to life, and trivializing it and just making it for something for people to jerk off to. And I think that takes something that's just, it is the life force. It is the most powerful thing. And you're making it so small. And it's like I don't know, it's like a tear in the fabric of reality or something to me.
There's this account, I like the name, account deactivated, says, I've never met a person who went into any kind of stripping or OnlyFans or whatever who wasn't affected by some kind of childhood sexual abuse, however mild, including myself. Thanks for sharing that. If you want to say more, please do. Be interested in hearing your experience around that. Yeah. And David Moore, I think sex is sacred and mundane. We're animals, but we're more than animals, or are we?
We're part of everything, right? We're part of the animal kingdom. So it's everyday and mundane, but it's also sacred because it's life.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I think happens when people have a lot of indiscriminate sex is the bonding that happens when you have sex with somebody. That bonding capacity gets damaged. The oxytocin that gets secreted is supposed to help you bond with that other person. And if you're having sex with whoever, it can really mess you up, because when you do meet the right person, you might have trouble forming a bond. I think our whole culture has trivialized sex and treated it like a commodity and something that's not a big deal. As you said earlier, I think that feminism has told women that the best way to be a woman is to be more like a man and to have indiscriminate sex and put our careers first and all that stuff. And I don't think personally, as a woman, I don't think I'm suited for that. I tried and it didn't work for me at all. And there's this podcast called Whatever that I occasionally will look at, and it's these relatively young men talking to women who do things like OnlyFans, and they make it clear to these women that we don't want a woman who's been with a lot of men, because to them they're just gross, which is odd because men in general seem to want women like that, but they don't want them to be their wife, you know?
Mm-hmm. That's the concept that in my mind, I always call it the sacrificial slut. Because it's this kind of concept that we want to see that. We want to see representations of that. We want to engage with that aspect of the feminine, that really, really wild, racy, promiscuous, pornographic, but we don't want to marry that. So it's just like a sacrifice of that woman for the purposes of what, the man who's using her wants. It's a sacrifice of who she is.
And I don't think a guy who has that ability to do that, to view these women as trashy and go from woman to woman to woman, but then he holds himself in higher regard and thinks, well, now I will go and get my true inheritance, a virgin. I think that those guys may go fuck themselves because they have really nasty exploitative natures, I think, to view women that way. And I think that it's also in some ways based on insecurity that, oh, if I get a virgin, she's not going to know if I can't do things quite properly. But meanwhile, I'm going to have a great time for a few years beforehand and probably waste a bunch of people's time too, because a lot of times when people are being promiscuous, that there is a chance that the other person might have some idea that they're seeking a relationship. So they're probably pulling the wool over people's eyes to an extent and giving them false hope because they've just decided that person is like the sacrificial slut. And they're going to go through a bunch of women like that. And then being the nice guy that they are, they're going to settle down with a decent girl. I've seen some of those podcast you're talking about. I've seen snippets of it, and I think the guys on it tend to be really hateful. And I feel like they're getting off on kind of shaming those women. And I would agree that what those women are doing isn't good for them. And I think they're making poor choices. And I think they've bought into a lie. But I think the guys are just the other side of it, and that the way that they're viewing things is really quite dark.
Mm. When I hear men talking like that, like the body count discourse was all the rage for a little while, I just think, well, you better not watch any pornography if you're going to have that kind of tone with women.
Yeah, because they're not being there. I don't think those guys, when I see them speaking to those women like that, I don't think these guys respect women.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. And also, maybe they have some kind of negative view of sex themselves if they think that there's something so shameful and disgusting about it. But that shame and disgust doesn't stick to them. Mm-hmm. It just sticks to the woman, which I think is really interesting.
Account deactivated says, I actually did video chat in college. I thought I was so wild and free, but my boundaries had been violated a lot by an older sibling. All the girls I worked with had been violated as kids. I was shocked when I met my husband, and he wasn't turned on by my past promiscuity, as all the men I had met before him weirdly encouraged it as showing what a cool girl I had been. Yeah, that's that part where you said, I thought I was so wild and free. I think that I'm kind of struggling to conceptualize this and articulate it. I'm sure lots of people have talked about this in a way that's much more clear than I am, but I think that's something I'm interested in learning more about is that, what is that experience like? Because there's some way I can remember, for instance, being in an abusive relationship, a bad marriage, where you find all these ways to justify and accept and even love what you're doing. And it's only later that you look back and you have this clarity and you go, wow, I was really, why did I let this happen to myself? And so I know that there's at what point on that timeline are you looking at the truth? And are you looking at different versions of the truth all throughout that timeline? Is the woman who looks back and says, why did I do that? That was horrible. I was being used. I did it because of my trauma. I feel really bad about it. And I'm mad at the people who let me or led me to do this thing. Was she right when she was wild and free? Or is she right now? And when she looks back with hindsight? And it's so interesting how our perspectives evolve, and we can encompass whatever we're doing with rationality and emotional acceptance through. We're just such interesting creatures, human beings.
And this is part of what's so confusing about being a woman, right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe being promiscuous is what she needed to do to heal, because in the past, sex had been something that was done to her against her will. And then there was a period where she was doing it to other people of her will, and she was reclaiming that in a way. And then as she healed and she no longer needed to do that, she had a different perspective on it. But it was at the time maybe what she felt she needed to do, but no longer had the need when she got older. I don't think that there is either perspective that's right or wrong. I think maybe it just is right at this time and wrong later.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm very interested in speaking with, if there are former sex workers who would like to talk about this. I'm very interested in exploring this perspective. And I've kind of been wondering about sexual morality and how we've become unglued from any kind of religious morals around it. And we're really moving towards everything that I see in popular culture, in my psychology education, in what our kids are being taught, says that sexual morality is just based on consent. It's just if somebody agrees to it, it's good. If you can get somebody to agree to do that, even if it costs money to get them to agree, then it's all good. And I think that there are a lot of people questioning that more and more, but also wondering what's the foundational basis for rebuilding a concept of sexuality if it's not based on just consent alone.
That's the question, right?
The golden rule, I guess. In the BDSM community, they have this mantra that things should be safe, sane, and consensual. And then the only word in there that's sort of ambiguous is sane. Like, where do you define sane? And
well,
to me, I stuck my toe in that water a little bit, and I don't understand it. Like, I don't understand why, if you care about someone, you would want to hurt them. And if you care about yourself, you would want to be hurt. Like, it doesn't compute for me. But they claim, I mean, they have some really dark stuff that they're working through, and they claim that it helps, but I don't understand it.
The whole sanity question is a really good one, because the acronym is bondage, dominance, sadism, and masochism. I mean, how
it's a little hint there that there might be something.
There might be something a little bit going on.
Slightly unbalanced. Well, and to me too, like, okay, so I think it's wonderful to be creative in bed, and I think you can sort of, take on different roles and all of that. Great. Have fun with your partner. However, the fact that there's a BDSM community, to me, starts to sound kind of fetishy, like the idea of grouping together and congregating with people just specifically to explore very narrow sexual interests in and of itself, to me, seems unbalanced, because you're putting those interests first and foremost versus, hey, I'm out here looking for my other half. I'm out here looking for my person, my soulmate. It feels objectifying and unbalanced to me from the get-go when a community forms around specific sexual likes and dislikes. I think it doesn't sit right with me. I'll just put it that way.
Well, they're definitely more concerned about the physical than the what's between your ears. When they meet you. I've known a lot of polyamorous people too, and they're always on the make. They're always looking for their next conquest, and they're not terribly interested in you as a person. And
that feels really soulless. That feels like, I don't know, just the thought of that makes me feel like my subjective self is diminishing, and I'm just this sort of body moving around looking for someone to use and looking to be used. And that just doesn't feel like, to me, that just doesn't feel like why I'm here on earth. It just doesn't feel like it. It feels really out of sync for me. And I don't mean that in some kind of like particular moralistic way, like, oh, Jesus wouldn't like it if you wore that skirt. Don't wear anything you wouldn't wear if you were sitting next to Jesus. I don't mean it in that way at all. I mean it in this like really primal way.
There's an addiction quality to it, because having sex is an altered state of consciousness. It takes you out of your everyday and out of yourself, and just like anything that feels good, it can be addictive. Yeah,
I think that's part of why it's sacred, because sex can be transcendent, because that's how we bring forth life. It is sort of a gateway to the transcendent sometimes, and so why trivialize that?
Well, I wish
I
we'd
think
gotten into
people,
polyamory sooner because I'd love to go down that track.
Maybe the three of us should have another conversation.
Yeah, I'd love it. I'd love it. Well, I know we have to go because of your group, but any last thoughts so we can wrap the conversation?
I just want to say thanks to Carolyn for coming today. I really appreciate your perspective, and it's been nice getting to meet you.
Oh, thank you. I was happy to do it. It was fun.
Yeah, I kind of cut you off there. Did you want to say one last thing, Carolyn, before we?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, I just hope nobody feels judged or anything by what we've said here. I think we're all on a journey and we all have different needs at different times in our lives, and we learn from our experiences, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautifully expressed. Thank you all for joining us so much. It's been a great conversation. Carolyn, I really enjoyed having you, and glad we got to get into some of these things. They're sort of tricky to talk about, especially when you're talking about them in front of a lot of people. So thank
Yeah.
you all for exploring it with us. And again, I am really interested in talking with people who have had experiences like this, like the one you're describing, account deactivated. If you care to share more, if you'd be interested in recording a conversation or joining us for one of these discussions, please email me through my website. It's Radical Center. I think it's the radicalcenterconsulting.com, but I've got it linked in my YouTube, so you can always find it in there. And thank you, Ninja Kitty, for being in the chat. And